Gustaf Adolf Tenggren was born in 1896 in Magra parish in Västra Götaland County, Sweden, the sixth of 7 children. His father, who was struggling as a painter and decorator, moved the entire family to Gothenburg, where he hoped to find more regular work. But his plan failed and he left his family for the USA, and that was the last they saw of him. So at only 11 years old, Gustaf started work as an apprentice in lithographic printers, but his talent for drawing was noticed, and at the age of 14 he received a scholarship to attend the School for Arts and Crafts while continuing to work at the printers. And in 1914 he was awarded another scholarship, this time to study painting at the Valand Art School in Gothenburg. By this point he was already working to an extent as a professional illustrator, and because Sweden remained neutral during the Great War, his early career was uninterrupted. Although I have no idea where some of these images were published, the evidence reveals that he was already drawn to the creation of folklore and fantasy images of the kind made popular by the older Swedish illustrator John Bauer and Britain's Arthur Rackham. He also created a series of monochromes which were printed in a Swedish magazine titled Vidi. But in 1918 he had a major breakthrough in his career when he became the illustrator of the popular Swedish folklore and fairy tales annual Among Gnomes and Trolls, which had to date been illustrated by John Bauer. In the same year he married his first wife, Anna Peterson, the sister of his best friend. The annual proved to be a perfect match for his Bauer-influenced technique, and of course as a Swedish national he had grown up with many of these folk tales. The work kept him busy for the next 2 years, but sensing correctly that there were bigger opportunities outside his home country, in 1920 he and his wife left for the USA and set up home in Cleveland, Ohio, where a couple of his sisters were already living. Tenggren continued to create a large volume of illustrations for Among Gnomes and Trolls, and he used this ongoing commission as a reliable source of regular income, whilst also trying to become established as an illustrator in the USA. He did pick up some occasional magazine and press advertising work for American clients, but his greatest success of this period was undoubtedly another Swedish publication, his 1922 colour edition of Grimm's Tales. And the images he created for this book were a clear demonstration of his ability to take written fantasy narrative and turn it into the most compelling and believable visual reality. Oddly, this collection wasn't published in the USA at the time, although it was some years later. But 1922 was also the year he and his wife relocated to New York City, and only a year later a virtual torrent of books he had been commissioned to illustrate were published in rapid succession. For A Boy of the Lost Crusade by Agnes Danforth Hughes, Tenggren created a series of watercolours which utilised a particularly subdued earthy palette and featured figure work which was noticeably more representational than that of his more fantasy-themed images. And in the same year a combined edition of Nathaniel Hawthorne's A Wonder Book for Boys and Girls and Tanglewood Tales, a collection of Greek myths and legends which had already drawn the attention of quite a few other illustrators of the period, was published. These dramatic, formally composed images used a similarly subdued colour palette and were a very plausible evocation of the characters and period, which brought his work to a wider audience and enhanced his reputation considerably. 1923 also saw the publication of an edition of Johanna Spyri's Heidi, which Tenggren tackled with his by now expected visual charm. But perhaps the most significant of this quartet of books was his visualization of the fairy tales of Madame d'Aulnoy, originally written in 1652. This was the first time in his American book commissions that he created images combining a range of characters, some of which were overtly caricatured and varying degrees of grotesque, through to more representational heroes and heroines, all of which were set in highly imaginative backgrounds and environments. The results were inevitably a resounding, enchanting success, which showcased the true depth of his skills and imagination. In an outrageous demonstration of creative productivity, more followed in 1924, including The Good Dog Book, a collection of sentimental tales about man's best friend, and although they were by no means inferior in terms of the visual skills employed, they were conspicuously lacking in the fantasy dimension for which he had come to be most admired. But in the same year he also illustrated an edition of Andrew Lang's Red Fairy book, which was more his favoured terrain. And this collection of fantasy tales from around the world gave Tenggren another opportunity to produce darkly romantic and highly evocative colour images, with another cast of slender protagonists and grotesque trolls and gnomes in idyllic and more menacing environments. By this point he had become popular enough with the creation of fantasy illustration that he was commissioned to create a 1925 calendar of his fairy and folk tale images to be hung on the walls of American households and businesses. There were 4 images in total, each one covering a particular 3-month season, and each one was exquisitely rendered in pen and watercolour washes, with fairy tale characters in settings evocative of the particular season, using an appropriate range of colour palettes. By 1926, Tenggren was struggling to handle the workload he had acquired, and in that year he illustrated his final batch of images for Among Gnomes and Trolls, and from this point on confined himself to working for American publishers. 1928 saw the publication of a relatively obscure title, Dicky Bird by Elizabeth Woodruff, and the collection of charming watercolours brought the book considerably more attention than it would otherwise have received. By this point, any book illustrated by Tenggren was pretty much guaranteed to be a commercial success. He was also creating press ads for all manner of domestic products, including a series for the silverware manufacturers Rogers Brothers, using a wildly romanticised pirate theme. Magazine fiction illustrations also continued, and among others in 1928 he produced this evocative piece of fairy tale nostalgia for Good Housekeeping. Sadly, the full-colour original was printed with a reduced palette of only 2 colours, and although still charming, it lost a lot as a consequence. But there were others which didn't suffer a similar fate and retained the entrancing qualities of Tenggren's colour originals. In 1930, following his divorce from Anna, he married again to Molly Froberg. The same year saw the disastrous Wall Street crash, which set in motion a serious financial depression. But unlike others, the evidence of his work suggests he was not unduly affected by it. Having said that, books such as 1932's edition of The Ring of the Nibelung only had a colour frontispiece, and all the page illustrations were pen and ink monochromes only. Nevertheless, his lesser-used talent for expressive pen and ink was well to the fore throughout and compensated considerably. Similarly, the same year's story of Sven the Wise and Sverre the Kind boasted only 2 particularly evocative colour pages, and 1933's Seldom and the Golden Cheese boasted only a colour frontispiece, and the rest of the book was illustrated with yet more entertaining and accomplished pen and ink drawings. Such was Tenggren's reputation by this point that in 1935 he was offered a position at Walt Disney Studios in Los Angeles to work on their ongoing production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first ever feature-length animation. And once he had relocated to California, he set about producing concept work, character and background art, and other crucial images in support of the project. In addition to his significant contributions to the look of the actual film, he was also commissioned to create promotional material, including a magazine feature published in Good Housekeeping and the poster for the film's release in 1937. Although his time with Disney was relatively short, Tenggren also made telling contributions, particularly with background art, to shorter animations, including The Ugly Duckling and The Old Mill, and had minor involvement in both Fantasia and some very early concept art for Bambi. But by far his most significant contribution was for the Disney production of Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio. And although the Disney version was far from an accurate retelling of the original, Tenggren manifestly did his level best to bring out the brooding menace inherent in the story, and created a series of stunning background images which made the whole production appear more credible than it otherwise would have. Pinocchio was eventually released to cinemas in 1940, but Tenggren had already left Disney and complained bitterly to whoever would listen that while there he had been both underappreciated and underpaid, given the value of his work to the productions, and especially Pinocchio. It's somewhat ironic that although it had been the very golden age traditional nature of his work which had attracted the attention of Disney, when Tenggren left to return to book illustration, he abandoned this style completely. This unexpected stylistic reinvention first appeared in 1940's edition of Mother Goose, and although still tonally painted, the characters and all other pictorial elements had become conspicuously less naturalistic. Equally significant was the virtual absence of any line drawing in these images, where his earlier output had been reliant on it as the foundation for his colour wash modelling. Also published in 1941, the Tenggren Tell It Again book returned to the same fantasy subjects he had worked with before his time at Disney. But again there was a more geometric structure and less organic feel to the images. Nevertheless, they were highly absorbing and attractively rendered, with their own distinctive, more modernist appeal. Why this radical transformation came about seems to be unrecorded, so I have no idea whether this was a creative or commercial decision on his part. But it's certainly true that many of those who stuck with Golden Age techniques floundered in later life. In 1942, he illustrated his first book for the newly established American publishing company Little Golden Books, in the form of The Pokey Little Puppy, written by Jeanette Sebring Lowry. At the time, this was an unusual and conspicuously cute foray into the picture book format, as opposed to the more text-driven illustrated books for older children he'd worked on previously. But it proved to be immensely popular, and for quite a few years it was the biggest-selling children's book in the USA. The following year he illustrated two musically themed books with less overtly cute imagery, obviously aimed at older children and maybe even adults. The first was a collection of illustrations with explanatory text outlining the narrative elements and characters featured in various operas, which seemed an unusually esoteric choice. The second was titled Sing for Christmas, which was obviously designed to appeal to the pre-Christmas market, with a collection of highly romanticised traditional winter scenes from bygone eras. In 1946, he illustrated another little golden book for youngsters, The Shy Little Kitten, which traded heavily on the great success of the earlier Puppy story, and more would follow during the coming years. In 1948, Tenggren joined the ranks of many other illustrators who had created picture books for the now contentiously titled Little Black Sambo, originally written in 1899 by Helen Bannerman. And although no longer considered acceptable, it was actually a benign little story about the adventures of a child who oddly wasn't black at all, but was Indian, as in the country. Pirates, Ships and Sailors by Catherine and Byron Jackson provided Tenggren with plenty of material to create suitably rousing but safe for viewing by children colour illustrations in 1951. And a year later he tackled Clement C. Moore's The Night Before Christmas with similar popular success. Many more illustrated books harnessing the popularity of Tenggren's illustrations were published in the 1950s, including the highly endearing and amusing picture book The Scrawny Tawny Lion by Catherine Jackson in 1952. And a year later he provided a series of absorbing absurd colour pages for the equally light-hearted Topsy-Turvy Circus written by George Duplaix. In 1953 he returned to the illustration of fairy tales with the Old English folk tale of Jack and the Beanstalk, and followed this publication with a selection of rewritten and somewhat sanitised stories from Grimm's Household Tales between 1954 and 1955. These included Thumbelina, the Golden Goose and Snow White and Rose Red. By this point it appears that the more overtly cute picture books had been abandoned in favour of a return to fantasy text for older children, and perhaps his most significant published work of the decade was a 1957 retelling of the Arabian Nights. The book featured a collection of stylised monochromes which appear to have been created with fine brushed gouache, giving them a particularly distinctive and satisfyingly solid finish, not previously seen in any of his output to date. And the colour pages he created were also a significant creative success, which very plausibly harnessed not just the costumes and environments of the Middle and Far East, but were actually executed with considerable ethnic credibility. The result was a modern-day equivalent of the kind of books formerly associated with the Golden Age, and particularly the Middle Eastern influence seen in Edmund Dulac's work. The book constituted a testament to Tenggren's enduring and apparently effortless ability to bring fantasy narratives to life, as if for the very first time, for an entirely new generation of reader. In 1959, he also began creating illustrations for a proposed book titled Myths and Legends, but for reasons I've been unable to discover, he was ultimately taken off the project and was replaced by the illustrative partnership of Alice and Martin Provenson. Whatever the reason, it can't have been the quality of Tenggren's images. But in 1961, his visualisation of another retelling, this time Geoffrey Chaucer's 14th century Canterbury Tales, was published, and although the bawdier and darker aspects of the original had been discreetly left out, it was nevertheless an entertaining medievalist outing. And only a year later, what appears to have been his last published book, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, appeared. This final offering showed again how his later more mannered approach to characters and backgrounds alike could have every bit as much potency as his earlier naturalism. If anything, the angularity and aesthetically distorted nature of the images made them somehow even more plausible. Tenggren and his wife Molly spent their later years in the home they had bought in 1944 at Dogfish Head, Southport, Maine, where in 1970, at the age of 74, he died from lung cancer. Molly lived for 14 more years, and before her own eventual death in 1984, she had generously donated many of her late husband's original works to the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis. Gustav Tenggren isn't the only illustrator to have undergone a stylistic transformation, and quite a few have featured already in this series. But with most others I can think of, the change was at least to some extent evolutionary. But in Tenggren's case, it seems to have been both instant and permanent. We all have our personal preferences when it comes to the work of illustrators, and for me it's Tenggren's early pen and watercolour work which holds the greatest fascination. I must confess that the charms of the Poky Little Puppy and similar Golden Book publications leave me cold, but then I'm hardly the demographic target for such work. And having said that, there is still plenty from his later output that has similar enduring merit as the earlier work. And whichever way you look at it, Gustav Tenggren was a hugely influential and significant figure in the evolution of 20th century narrative illustration.